my understanding is what we're doing today is we're doing the 20th century. And we're pulling it all together. That's my assignment. So we should be able to do that in an hour. And so as much as possible, I want us to make this a conversation. So just be ready. I might turn on you at any point and ask your thoughts about any of this, because what we're doing is actually very useful. When they asked me to do this, I jumped at the chance, because this is supposedly what we teach people to be able to how to do. If you can think historically and sort of know how the pieces fit together. And so what we're going to try to do today is see how the 20th century was the outgrowth of all the things that had happened up to that point, or not. Because I've been struck by two big patterns in history. Now, I've been studying it for 35 years or something. One, some things never change. People are people. You can go back and you read back 17th century and you go, yep, just like today. On the other hand, what we expect to happen never does. Somehow we've got to put both those two things together. How can it be that you have the same patterns, the same emotional hardware, so to speak, that people have throughout all times and across all places, and yet we somehow differ so much? And how can it be that you have the same patterns playing out for so long in American history, and things that nobody anticipated can unfold? That strikes me as the central challenge of what being a historian is all about. So we're going to talk today about the struggle for black rights. We're going to talk about the struggle for women's rights. We're going to talk about the course of economic change, and we're going to talk about the evolution of U.S. foreign policy. Now, you know and I know that in our textbook, we chop these things up into little pieces, right? Because it's got to fit into a chapter, then it's got to fit on the quiz, and then it's got to fit on the exam, and then it's got to fit on the SOLs. But we also know that that's misleading, that these things are no more just little slices of something than you can take a piece of the river out of it. Okay? They flow directly from all the things that have come before. So from one point of view, you have these discrete events, we often call them, a world war, a Great Depression. But you could also imagine that these are really outcroppings of much longer term processes. So that's what I want to talk about today, is to think about how do we explain things like the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Freedom Struggle, and which was at the same time inevitable and deeply unlikely. And certainly nobody living through it thought it was inevitable. So let's just start there, and we'll see these different themes coming through. I will say I remember an old Saturday Night Live skit. I remember the coffee talk. Mike Myers dressed up like a woman, and he came on there for just one time. He says, "The progressive era, neither progressive nor an era. Discuss." And I thought that was such a perfect midterm exam, right? Neither progressive nor an era. Discuss. So that gets at something of what we're going to be talking about today. How is it that these things are neither an era, but they have the name of an era? And how is it maybe that they don't have a name, but that they are markers in the flow of history? So let's think about the Black Freedom Struggle. Black Freedom Struggle really began the day the first Africans were brought against their will to this continent. There was never a moment that I've been able to see that black people were not fighting for their freedom. And it was under slavery, when they did not speak each other's language because they were brought from all over West Africa. And it continued as an African-American culture emerged, and as the sex ratio evened out in the 18th century and the population began reproducing itself, and a uniquely African-American culture began to emerge. And you go back, you look at the records, the one thing you're going to find is that people held in slavery never accepted it. You will see that there was always the running away, always the breaking of tools, always the resistance, always the violence. And so you could argue that the Civil Rights Movement had been going on for 400 years by the time it came. Under slavery, and we need to remember, this is a little bit hard for our students to remember, people tend to think sometimes about slavery as just what we call the antebellum era. And those of you who are here for our Civil War thing know that we don't use that word because it's always the antebellum era. We just don't know when the next war is. And the same way that we're not organizing our lives around some war we don't know is coming, neither did people in the 1840s and 50s. Okay? So we got to put that element of surprise there. But slavery, by the time of the American Civil War, had existed for longer than the Civil War has passed from us. Slavery had been here for 200 years by the time the Civil War came along. 250 years. So the United States had lived with slavery, accepted it. The whole country had embedded it into its fundamental structures for 250 years, and then it's suddenly gone. Nowhere else in the world did you find the largest and most powerful system of slavery in the modern world end just like that. 4 years. Over. No compensation for the slaveholders, no period of apprenticeship, no real help for the people who were freed. But on the other hand, more political rights than any other emancipated population in the Western Hemisphere met. So you already have this anomalous situation, because what's unusual about American slavery? It's the only enslaved population that reproduced itself. In the Western Hemisphere, this is the only population that biologically reproduced itself. So as you know, the slave trade ended over a half century before the Civil War came, before emancipation. But you also know that the slave population continued to grow. And you may also know that Virginia was the largest enslaved population at the time of the Civil War, and that about 500,000 people lived in slavery here at the time of the Civil War. And then it all ended. Nobody ever voted and said, hey, let's end slavery. Nobody said the time has come. Nobody said the antebellum period is over. What happened was a war started. That was about slavery, but the people who started the war did not think that, they could not imagine, whether you were abolitionist or black or white or Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis, nobody could imagine that slavery was going to end in 4 years, because it did not seem possible, because nobody had seen it happen anywhere else in the world. Okay. And then it does, as a result of the war. The war begins. Lincoln realizes that in order to end slavery, in order to defeat the Confederacy, he's going to have to destroy slavery. And then he realizes that to win, he's going to have the fighting of black men, because not enough white men in the North are signing up. Without black men, the Civil War would not have been won by the North, and slavery would not have been brought to an end. But when it does come to an end, then, as a result of the war, there's nothing in place whatsoever to replace it. There's no help in place. Reconstruction comes, bless you, comes and goes for a short period. But generally, the formerly enslaved population are entirely on their own for the next 100 years. And the freedom struggle never stops, not for a moment. And so then you have the paradox of this enslaved population that's coming into freedom more abruptly than any other population in the Western Hemisphere, ends up being the most successful emancipated population in the Western Hemisphere. And just think about it. Today, the African American purchasing power is greater than, like, I can't remember what the number on this is, but it's more than many, many nations. Okay? Just what African Americans in this country alone have. And you can look around here and know that by 1910, I still find this an amazing statistic, I've been saying for 20 years. By 1910, 80% of the black families in Virginia owned their own land. From zero in 1865 to 80% in 1910, with nobody giving them anything.
Did you say
80. Can you believe that? Now, what they often owned, they called it the spare ribs and backbone. You know, it was the land that white people didn't want, but it was enough to have a home. It was enough to have the home place. It was enough to have something where they couldn't come and take it away from you. So you'd often have to go out and share a crop on somebody else's land, or go out and work in the oyster beds or work in the tobacco factories, but you would have your own place. That strikes me as a miracle. And this is the same time that the white population, the rural population, is losing land. So at the time of the Civil War, something like 70% of white farmers owned their own land. but by the 1930s, only 30% do. So you got this fact of, and of course right here in Richmond, Jackson Ward, one of the most successful black business districts in the United States, and thus in the world, right here in our own backyard. We all know about Maggie Walker making that out of that, but she's not coming out of nowhere. She's coming on a strong entrepreneurial black tradition. So you have that fundamental break in the middle of freedom, of slavery becoming freedom, and of Reconstruction, and of black people making these economic gains. But at the same time that black people make these economic gains, the white people put new obstacles in their path. So at the very time that this black population is buying land, as we all know, that was the very years when segregation was put into place. And notice, this is 35 years after emancipation. Segregation is not really written into law in this state till about 1900. And then you have the Constitutional Convention that takes away the vote from black men at the beginning of the 20th century. So if you try to draw a trajectory, what's the course of the black freedom struggle that's leading to the civil rights movement? Well, it looks like a long struggle, a plateau under slavery, and then suddenly freedom, and then building economic power in churches and schools and self-help. Okay, all those things happen. But then segregation and stripping away the vote put in at the beginning of the 20th century. It looks like a setback. It is a profound setback. And so as a result, you would have had in the late 19th century black congressmen being elected from Virginia. But by 1920, that's unimaginable. It's like the river's running backwards. Okay, so the 1920s and 1930s are the big heyday of segregation. And once white people discover that they like this idea of hedging in all this black ambition and hard work and accomplishment and labeling everything white and colored and holding things in place and labeling every railroad car and every movie theater and every water fountain and segregating the books during summertime from the black and white schools, obviously segregating the schools and the Bibles that people swear on in the courthouse. That's more in the 1920s and 30s than it would have been in the 1870s and 1880s. So you have this strange thing of segregation being a new thing. So you think, that sounds, if that's a river, you know, people maybe know the famous book of Vincent Harding, There Is a River. That's a river with a lot of rapids in it, and a lot of falls and pools. It's certainly just not unbroken, and it can seem to almost stop sometimes, and then suddenly rushes ahead. So World War II comes along, we'll talk about that in a minute. And when it does, here in Virginia, segregation has never been tighter. And you have offices that are dedicated to tracing people's racial purity. And they go in and they make people register their racial history to make sure that there's no mixing of black and white and of red. Okay, and it becomes, you wonder where the American Indian tribes that lived here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years before any of the stories we're talking about now began. They were kind of written out of the story because they'd intermarried with black people. If Indians did that, you're not Indian anymore, you're black. And you're to be segregated and controlled. So the Racial Purity Act, and there's an entire office that does this. And he'll write, and he's sitting there with all these genealogical records, and he'll write letters to people if he discovers they're getting ready to marry someone he considers African American. So that's what it's like in the 1920s and 30s right here in Virginia. If you told somebody, hey, you're getting ready to see the other big break in American history, the greatest moral victory in our history, the Civil Rights Movement, that would have seemed pretty far removed. Now, 1920s and the 30s, John Armstrong, editor of the Afro-American, the predecessor to the Free Press, downtown Richmond, just never gave up, just constantly fighting week after week after week against this disfranchisement, against this segregation, against this injustice. But I don't believe even he would have thought about what was getting ready to happen. Now, there are white people in the 20s and 30s who say, this has got a stranglehold on us. This segregation is killing Virginia. It's killing the South, as well as being unjust, unchristian. We should ameliorate it. We should find ways to work together. And so you find groups that are reaching out, that are trying to come to some kind of understanding. And of course, individual blacks and individual whites are finding all different kinds of ways to be human to each other because they don't really have any choice. But the state, the institutions, are ever more dedicated to keeping black and white apart. And the bird machine, the great political power to which we have statues, is built on this segregation. And the sad thing is, too, that what happens is that by not allowing black people to vote, that democracy is smothered for white people in Virginia, too. By the 1920s, you only have about 20% of the electorate bothering to vote. What's the point? The Democrats run everything. There's no reason to have a Republican Party. And so it just becomes a big machine. So it looks pretty much under control. You got a political machine, powerful with great seniority in Washington. You got everything labeled white and colored. You got all the political power in the hands of a few people. You've got economic power in the hands of white people, of hiring and firing and employing. But then, as we know, just like slavery suddenly ended, the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement comes. Now we know one of the places that it begins is in the New Deal, in which there's a language, not unlike today with President Obama, of talking about greater equality. But we also know that Franklin Roosevelt wouldn't sign a bill to stop lynching. We also know that the public works programs are segregated. So on one hand, you got one foot on the accelerator. It looks like they're doing things with Social Security and unemployment and things like that that are a benefit to all people of lesser means regardless of their race. On the other hand, segregation seems firmly impressed. And then World War II comes along. And once again, the United States needs black men to fight and needs black women to be in the factories. And in one of the amazing things about American history, as always, black people step up to a country that has been unfair to them for generations and fights for their country in World War II, just like they had in World War I. And when they fight, and people are reading their newspapers every day, and they read about this horrible enemy that we have, who wants to build everything he's doing on telling us that some people are inferior to other people, that some people must be kept in place in segregated parts of cities, that some people must be constantly under scrutiny, that some people are the cause for all the problems around. And a new word enters American history, and you may be surprised to know this is the first time it's really widely used: racism. It's a 20th century word. In many ways, a 20th century concept. And the idea, it's interesting, of course, that we first use it to describe somebody else. And then people go, gosh, where else would it be that things like this are happening? It'd be right here in America, where we're doing the same things. And so what you find is that a sense of discomfort, of sudden self-awareness begins to emerge at the same time that black people who are fighting or making the means for us to fight or sustain the nation say, how can it be right for us to attack Adolf Hitler and who speaks these hateful things and to tolerate what we have in our own country? Now, there's nothing new, no new idea in all this to African Americans. It's not like it had not occurred to them that this was profoundly wrong. But suddenly you found the United States putting all its might into fighting against a racist regime. And the hypocrisy became very apparent to a lot of people. But did it have an immediate end to segregation? Did just the awareness of this lead to the Civil Rights Movement? Well, as you know, the answer is no. People come back, People have jobs to fill. People have work to do. 45, 46, Harry Truman integrates the military, but instead, you read about Virginia, they say what we're going to do is we're going to follow separate but equal to the letter. We're going to build excellent schools for the Negroes. There's going to be excellent colored schools. We're going to spend money on that. And they think that's the enlightened thing, but nobody's thinking, well, of course, schools can't be separate and still be equal. And then in 1951, right here in Virginia, in the event that's memorialized on the Capitol Square now, as of last summer, a 16-year-old girl, Barbara Johns, says, our school looks nothing like equal here in Farmville. Let's march down to City Hall. Now, she's not marching to end separate but equal. She's not marching to end segregation, because just like it seemed impossible to end slavery in 1861, it seems impossible to a lot of people to end segregation. The whites hold all the cards in the South in 1951. Where in the world is leverage going to come from? And the white North certainly doesn't seem interested. They haven't lifted a finger for 100 years now since emancipation to stop the South from putting in segregation or disfranchisement. Matter of fact, the North and the Supreme Court actually makes it possible for all this to happen. So why does the civil rights movement emerge in the early 1950s then? Our textbooks say it's because of World War II, but that doesn't have immediate consequences. It happened because black people made it happen. And what did they draw on? So after Barbara Johns marches down to the city court and gets all her, and she did mislead her principal, which as a president now I find unfortunate, but I guess it's for a good cause, and got him out of the building, and then all the students marched down there. And then Oliver Hill says he'll take on the case, but only if they don't just fight for a better school, which was the original purpose of all of this, but rather to combine that case with other ones that are merging around the South, here from Virginia, all the way to Topeka, Kansas, and combine them in Brown versus Board of Education. So the civil rights movement then draws upon all those generations back during the 20s and 30s when segregation was so tightly in place, and even back to the 1910s where the land was being owned, and even back to 1870s and 60s when those churches and schools and fraternal organizations and women's leadership groups were being formed. And without those roots that had been growing during the very hard times when there seemed absolutely no hope of getting from beneath this yoke. In fact, those roots were growing all during the time that segregation and disfranchisement was being put into place. But how could we have people like Thurgood Marshall and Oliver Hill? It's because there had been a black middle class that had been growing, strengthening itself, often based in the churches, but also in places like Howard University, Hampton, Fisk, that had been laying the groundwork for something that was going to come in the future. So if you didn't have African American lawyers ready in the early 1950s to use the laws of the nation to fundamentally change the laws of the nation, you wouldn't have had that happen. But if you'd not had a broad black middle class, you wouldn't have had the other things that happens. Now, your students all know about Rosa Parks. Okay, what's the story there? Well, she was already associated with the NAACP. It wasn't just like she suddenly decided one day not to give up her seat on the bus. And she was, talk about her being a seamstress, but she was from a middle class family. And who's this Martin Luther King guy, right? Third generation minister, gone to Boston University, married woman from Boston, come back in this upper middle class black neighborhood in Atlanta, and then goes to Montgomery. Also drawing on that strong tradition that had gone back generations to be able to have the education, the political eloquence, and the knowledge of world history. Mahatma Gandhi, okay? So in the same way that world history in the case of Hitler, begins to dislodge and plant a doubt in the minds of many white Americans that this segregation thing could possibly be justified. Now you also have the idea of world history of King drawing on this thing that seemed nothing could be farther removed, you'd think, from the rural South than Gandhi and the anti-colonial struggle against the English. But then that's what's happening. Who would have predicted that? I can tell you for sure that what's going to happen after World War II, that they're going to draw on Indian ideas to end this. Well, of course not. But where do those Indian ideas resonate? In the black churches. Had the black churches been a force for resistance and struggle against segregation? No. Okay? They had not been. They'd been a source of strength. They'd been a source of pride. They'd been an anchor in people's deepest identity. But black preachers were not considered to be radicals. Black preachers were considered to be kind of going along, right? And so you would not have predicted that what came to be the case, these deep wells of Afro-American Christianity, which had been made fun of by Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois for being so conservative, would be transmogrified into the greatest source of strength by this black middle class going into the churches using these ideas of nonviolent resistance. So on one hand, the black freedom struggle had been going on unbroken now for 300 years. On the other hand, it's completely unpredictable that the elements of it could not have be combined. Then you get to these things, well, what if King had not been in Montgomery? What if they just had that boycott? Now, think of how it is that this all begins. What is it that they do to get their power? They say we're going to use our power as a consumer to not ride the bus. Now, why is that a big deal? Because you're bringing the bus company to its knees, and they refuse to shop in these stores that won't let them try on clothes. Okay? They say, we'll just boycott you. Well, if they hadn't already been buying stuff, if they hadn't already been building middle class, they would have had they would have no economic power to do that. So you all know how the textbooks always want us to divide up Booker T. Washington against W.B. Du Bois. You can hear what nonsense this is, right? They didn't think that. Booker T. Washington says, I tell you what, until we have some money that we can boycott, until we have some money that we can build our own institutions, until we have some money that the white man can't tell us what to do because we're our own bosses and we're buying and selling to ourselves and have our own newspapers, we're not going to be able to do anything. And Du Bois says, until we have political power, we're not really going to be able to change anything, but what we need to focus on is education. Well, you can see they were both right. If you hadn't had the talented 10th, you would not have had the civil rights movement when you did. But if you'd not had a strong black middle and working class who was willing to use its economic power as the main engine to drive the early civil rights movement, you would not have had it either. So maybe rather than just thinking of one river, just think of all these different tributaries that are flowing into all this. Now, let's tell ourselves the story a little bit, and you know what happened. So you got 51 Farmville, 54 Brown v. Board. Then more years go by. Name me a big political event, the Civil Rights Movement in 1958, 59, and then students, 1960, come in the sit-ins. Another layer on top of all this. So the Civil Rights Movement, which sounds like it's sort of like a parade or gathering all this force, in fact, is quite discontinuous. It tends to be long periods of delay as the white South stalls every way they can. All of you know about massive resistance, right? In which they just shut down the schools rather than go along with the federal power. And think about what are the counter sit-ins too? That's also using your economic power to do that, okay? So then, of course, think then how things happening after that. 61, freedom rides. Then you got the Cold War going on. We'll talk about, you see how these international and national things are gathering. And then 63, 64, March on Washington. And then that's what our students think of. You sort of say, when was the Civil Rights Movement? And they will say, well, from Montgomery through a speech at March on Washington. Well, then what happens? How do we tell a coherent story about after 1968, when Dr. King is assassinated? What do we say about the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s? How is it that Barack Obama becomes President of the United States out of all that? I would say that we don't tell our students a coherent story about how all these things fit together. We just act like they... I remember I was in Atlanta for the Olympics in '96, and it was all about Dr. King. But if you were from another country, say, so what did he do? You know, well, he was a great man. Well, yeah, what he did? He overthrew a systematic system of injustice that we tolerated here in this city throughout our entire history. But we never talked about what he overthrew. It was just that he was a great man, right? So you forget about these different parts of it. So then what happens after 68? The riots and the burning of the cities, right? Does it stop? Of course not. Then it transforms into other forms in which you're still having people are in the legislative halls and in the courts constantly pushing. And you start having black political officials elected in the South. Okay? We know about Douglas Wilder, but there are also mayors and postmasters and tax collectors. That's laying the foundation in the 1970s and 1980s that can allow, in retrospect, we see something else that seemed impossible a few years ago, that we would have a president of African ancestry in this country. How can it happen? It can only happen if it draws on those very deep roots that we're talking about before, right? So, this goes back to the theme I'm saying. On one hand, in the big picture, if you assume that, as Lincoln says, justice cannot be denied forever, the Civil Rights Movement is bound to happen. But if you turn up the magnification, or turn the telescope the other way around, and say, why was there a Civil Rights Movement? It took a lot of things that had to happen first, and there was an unpredictable quality. Certainly, if nobody in the 1930s would have guessed that within 15 years you would have had a Supreme Court decision that would overturn the fundamental law of the land, that separate but equal was right. So, you see what I'm trying to do is that this is usually, 10 different chapters I just told you, right? Right? And within each chapter, okay, that makes sense. But it's like you take the stuff out of this box and lay it all out there. Whoa! That's a different story. So what I would say that any time that we're trying to explain the fundamental changes of American history, and I don't think anything's more fundamental to this nation than that story we just told of how you could have by far the largest and most powerful system of slavery in the world, followed by the most abrupt process of emancipation, followed by the emergence of the most successful emancipated population in world history. In world history. And we're all struck by, the enduring poverty and injustice of African Americans, but despite that, go to other places and you will see that African Americans have been able to build for themselves a kind of prosperity and political strength, as well as culture, that has no parallel. And then all of that force is then captured by lawyers like Hill and Marshall, political leaders like King, or religious leaders, really moral leaders like King, articulated in a different voice by Malcolm X, again drawing on. So now you have black Christianity, okay, we know about that, but then suddenly you have India coming in, and now you're having Islam coming in. Malcolm X, right? That's what he's doing. He's trying to step outside of the Christian tradition to say, let's look at it from another perspective, from this religious perspective, and you'll see that as a way to shake things loose. Then the growth of the political power, all the same time that with every new step forward, people have found ways to resist it. So you have the end of legal segregation, so people say, great, we'll just move to the suburbs. Right? We'll just create new academies, private schools. We'll just avoid it that way. And we know we're still in this box. Okay? We know that that is kind of a passive resistance. We just won't fight back. We'll just remove ourselves. Okay? So now, how do we account for the election of Barack Obama? Let's talk about, okay, I'm going to tell you a story, just an outline. You tell me if this seems possible. First of all, you're going to have a white woman join the Ford Foundation and go to Indonesia and become an anthropologist. And then while she's over there, she's going to fall in love with a man from Africa, from Kenya, and they'll have a child, but then she will have to raise this child on her own in Hawaii. It's obvious that he's going to become the President of the United States, right? So it strikes me that the big challenge is how do we make the past comprehensible to our students? And it's easy to rub off all the edges and to make it look like it's just a matter of time till these things happen and forget these profound surprises that led to what we have now. And combining those two strikes me as the great excitement of what history is. And I know a lot of you teach other subjects, unlike me. So I'm just a historian. I don't teach economics, I don't teach government, I don't teach sociology. I just believe in what I do. And what do I like about what I do? We're the only ones that have surprise. Okay? Everything else is about structures. Okay? Here's economic laws and the way they play out. Or here's how a bill becomes a law. You know? Or here is the fundamental structures of society. But history, whoa, surprise, sudden change. No, where'd this come from? Strikes me that lately we have recognized how little we understand about what's happening. Tell me, did a poll get it right after any election in the fall as we're leading up to the presidential election? No. And unless I missed the memo, nobody told me the largest financial downturn in 70 years was coming, right? And yet we look back on the past and we seem so complacent. Well, yes, of course. I'm here to tell you, folks, they had no idea what was going on either. Abraham Lincoln, he says, I don't control events. Events control me. And until we restore that sense of surprise to our students, history is going to, and I always quote my mom, who was a 5th grade teacher for 30 years. I told her I was going to go to graduate school in history, and she said, what for, honey? We already know what happened. And I've dedicated my life to pointing out, Mom, we don't know what happened. And it's that illusion that we know what happened that makes us so incapable of imagining a better future. Okay? As long as we keep things in place, patted down, then we forget how full of surprise things are. Now, just telling the story of the Black freedom struggle, you see the surprise of thinking about this for a living. I guess, you know, I've so many times, even I can think, just when I don't believe that struggle, when the injustice can be any greater, it turns out that it is. On the other hand, just when I give up on the country, then it turns out that it has the capacity for this kind of moral growth and change in it that it doesn't have. It strikes me that one thing, if you're teaching history, is you can tell our young people things can be so much better than you can imagine right now. But be careful, they can be a lot worse than you can imagine now. Don't be complacent. So that's my whole mission in life when I'm speaking as a historian, is that sense of contingency, that sense of surprise, of sudden pivots, of things coming together in unanticipated ways to create something that just one path by itself can never do it. That's why just looking at economics by itself explains some things, but not much. You have to put it together with politics to understand. So let's take another vein. So the other thing we might think about is women's rights. There, as you know, women found ways to exert their individuality throughout all of American history as well. And you know about, Mrs. Adams telling her husband, remember the ladies and all that. You know about Seneca Falls, 1848, and the women's movement. But you also know that, and here's how the stories intersect, Reconstruction, the great moment of possibility for African Americans, the women's movement breaks away because they say, why should illiterate black former enslaved men get the vote when I, who've been to Vassar or whatever, can't? And so what we think of now, we think, in the 60s and 70s, the feminist movement, the black freedom struggle, kind of being part of the same thing. But they broke apart there. And they were the same in the 1840s and 1850s, but then they break apart. And they grow farther and farther apart. And you find the people who are calling for segregation, disfranchisement, often were white women. Matter of fact, and you think about when the great episode of lynching in this country was in the 1890s, it was all about white women. And so you find those are two kinds of struggle. Both of them have legitimate claims, but that are at odds with each other. So women's suffrage begins out west, where they need it for political purposes. You need to have enough voters to be able to become a state. So let's enfranchise women. And then you have the 19th Amendment. Okay, now why does that come along when it does? Is it just that things are ripe? It's just that now people recognize that it's time here in the early 20th century, the century of progress, that will give women the right to vote? No, in many ways it grows out of World War I. Okay? And out of all these decades of struggle. In the same way the black freedom struggle grows out of generations of people fighting with not much to show for it, the women's suffrage movement grows out of generations of people struggling without much to show for it. So in the 1920s, suddenly, when women are able to vote in the South, not really going along with it, but being forced into it, what happens? 1 million women, black and white, vote in the South in 1920s. They had not voted in the 19 teens. What do? They vote for Republicans, which you just simply did not do in the South in the 1920s, because the Democrats are the ones who will hold all the power and hold white supremacy. But we can't see, and there's a great book written by my colleague Lori Schuyler called The Weight of Their Votes. And the men in the 1920s are just freaking out because you go to the polling place, which used to be just a great place to spit and smoke and drink. And now one of her chapter titles is called "The Place Smelled Like Perfume." And everybody's got to be all nice and stuff because women are going to come to vote, And they do that. And then you find that, okay, the 20s come along, the 30s. Are we building momentum? Does this make any difference? Doesn't seem to be. 1940s, Rosie the Riveter, but that comes and goes. So when you think about when is the time of all the, Donna Reed and the sitcoms and Leave It to Beaver, and which time you see that women seem to be the most circumscribed by gender roles, is the 1950s. And Marilyn Monroe, Mr. President, right? And all this sort of stuff. So that doesn't look like it's a path toward independence. And you had more women working in the 1930s than you did in the 1950s. And you had a larger percentage of women in college. So it's like history's rolling backwards again. But then suddenly it twists around in the 1960s, and women who had been involved in the black freedom struggle find a new commonality. And they say that if it's wrong for people to be oppressed by the color of their skin, it's also wrong for people to be oppressed just by what sex they are. And so the women who lead the women's movement of the late 60s are often veterans of the freedom struggle for black Americans. And then they grow out of all that. Now, so you got to keep that in mind, okay? So there's another story that's hardly just a straight line. Progress! Getting better all the time. No, it starts, and then it fizzles out, then it's just flat, then nothing happens, then it goes backwards, and then it shoots forward. Okay? Because I notice I teach freshmen here now, and all their papers have to end with the statement like, and thus Americans struggle forward to create a... And I said, come on. Sometimes they do. A lot of times they don't. You can't say things are getting better in that regard. So the women's movement grows out of the black freedom struggle as well. You couldn't have predicted that because you couldn't predicted the civil rights movement. Okay, so you can see that these things are both drawing back from deep in the 19th century, and without the changes of the 19th century, they could not have happened. But there was nothing in the 19th century that made them inevitable to happen in the 20th. Okay, let's think about economic change. The chapters that I hate the most in textbooks are the ones about industrialization and urbanization. Anything that's an "ization" is a bad idea. It's unhistorical. It's like, okay, we're going to start industrializing. And it makes it, right? And it goes forward. And it's like, yeah, urbanization. Well, let's look at Richmond. What's urbanization mean, right? First of all, it takes them forever to get up here to the falls. You know, it's like 100 years from the time there's European settlement. Is it time to start Richmond? Yeah, it's late 18th century. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. And then it suddenly lurches forward. And here's a quiz that I gave at the sesquicentennial thing, I think. What was the major crop in Virginia in 1860? Wheat. Most enslaved people grew wheat. Okay? And that's why you take the canal walk, you're walking under mills, grist mills, right? And what were they doing? They were selling it to South America. So Virginia wheat grown by enslaved people, brought to Richmond, milled, put on ships, taken down the James and sent to South America. Okay? Tredegar Iron Works, one of the more advanced iron production facilities in the United States, making railroad locomotives. You got to be pretty good to make a locomotive that complex out of all that. And so why is Richmond the capital of the Confederacy? It's not because it's somehow the most southern. Matter of fact, a lot of people say this place seems to be crawling with Yankees and crawling with Irishmen and crawling with Germans and crawling with Jews and crawling with free black people. So it becomes the capital of the Confederacy because it's the most northern city, because it's industrial. That makes sense. So they think we'll be like the Boston or the New York of this new nation, the Confederacy, which is by itself is going to be the fourth richest economy in the world, which already is. At the time that the Confederacy was created, it's the fourth richest economy in the world. And so Richmond, which now we know the burden that we all carry about being the capital of the Confederacy and being old-timey and all that, becomes that because it's so modern. Then the economic change, you may have heard the place was burned, and then it goes into long periods. But look where all the big buildings are out there now. Look at Monument Avenue. Somebody had some money around the turn of the century. There's a lot of buildings. Where's this come from? It comes from tobacco. Because Richmond is the place where they invented a machine that can make 100,000 cigarettes a day, the Bonsack machine. And then cigarettes are the first mass-produced products that have like little cards they give out, like in bubble gum. That's invented for cigarettes. And mass advertising is developed for cigarettes. So Richmond gets rich off tobacco, but not from Thomas Jefferson's era, but rather in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so Richmond's doing pretty well in the 20s and 30s and the 40s and 50s. And then they have a great idea. Let's put an interstate through it. Let's just tear the dickens out of all these African-American neighborhoods like Jackson Ward that are flourishing and build these suburbs. And we know what happened. Now, here's economic progress that we're still suffering under, that dislocated, ripped apart the fabric of our city. And now you have Chesterfield County being one of the fastest growing counties in the country. Goochland County is the richest county per capita in the United States. Who'd have thought that? But anyway, so you wouldn't have seen that coming. Now it's coming back. People like old houses and things, so economic development now may build on these other things. So you can see even things like urbanization. What does that mean? It means making cities, but cities are unmade and remade as much as anything else. So we're thinking about economic history. It's not just this line of progress or development or modernization or whatever. It doesn't work that way. Right now, Richmond used to be a lot more industrial than it is now. So you're having deindustrialization. So when you think about all of American history, it can't just be that we start out as farms and end up as industrial cities, which I'm afraid is what our textbooks make it sound like. Doesn't it? I'm glad to see people nodding. Also, as annoyed as I am about all that, that just makes me mad. Because what it does is you can't explain all the things that have happened if you just imagine that we're going from rural to urban, or that there is such a thing as a city that just develops. Now, this helps explain something else. So you have to talk about the Great Depression, right? Which suddenly looks different than it did 2 years ago. When you're teaching about the Great Depression, back in old times when they didn't know how to run the economy, those fools let the things fall apart. Now we've got complete control with the Federal Reserve and all these sort of... And of course, now we suddenly see that we didn't know what we were doing either. And with every kind of computer and things that look as if they're creating stability and sort of spreading the risk around so much, it sounds like nothing like so much as the 1920s in our textbooks. Those fools are out drinking gin out of bathtubs and doing the Charleston and buying all these stocks and inventing electric vacuum cleaners, and everybody's getting radios in their cars. Look at the 1990s. People driving SUVs and, all this stuff. But what ties it all together? You could argue the same reason that you had the Civil War, the Great Depression, and whatever this is we're going through right now, all had their origins in the same thing. Sudden changes in communication. At the time of the Civil War, the telegraph is only about 15 years old. And the telegraph, compared to what was before, makes the internet look like nothing compared to what was before here. We had long-distance telephones, all that sort of stuff. But the telegraph, suddenly you could communicate across the Atlantic Ocean instantaneously. And railroads, which had also been around only about 20 years, at the length of the internet now, suddenly for the first time in human history, you could go faster than a horse or a boat could take you. You could go 25, 30 miles an hour, which sounds funny to us, but when you could go 4 before that for a little while, this is a fundamental. What does this mean then? Is that you can imagine a brand new nation that's going to stretch from Virginia to Texas, that's going to cover something the size of continental Europe, that's going to be based on slavery, that's going to declare its own freedom. How could you imagine that? Because it's all tied together by telegraphs and railroads, and it's all woven together. These people don't know each other. It's all tied together in that way. And when you find out that something that somebody says up in Massachusetts that you read about the next day in Richmond, and you just get mad, and this John Brown guy comes out, and all of a sudden you find bells tolling all across the north in mourning, that couldn't have happened until you'd had a telegraph spreading all the news in the newspapers everywhere. Then the 1920s, we started having these new developments of the radio and the automobile, tying all these different kind of things together. And markets, the United States is out with these cigarettes, selling them all over the world, tied into this market. And it just looks like there's so many great investment opportunities that people start piling on more and more until it collapses like a house of cards. And we know in our own time, the internet, suddenly you can be trading all around the world all the time, looking for slight imbalances in Indonesia or Russia and natural gas prices, that you can exploit those and things. That's how you can make a lot of money. And it ties things together, but what that means is once things begin to unravel one place, they unravel all over the place. So rather than thinking about the 1920s, prosperity, the 1930s, depression, the 1950s, prosperity, and there were huge recessions in the 1950s. The 1960s, protests and long hair and stuff, I don't know what happens. But the 60s were laying the foundation for all the inflation of the 1970s. And there's a book about the 1970s called It Seemed Like Nothing Happened. But when you look back on it, it was a time of fundamental change. The worst stock market crash since the Great Depression, the worst unemployment since the Great Depression, and all these gas prices. But we think about the 70s show, people had long collars and disco and stuff. It's like, no, there were these big changes going on. And then when the 80s and 90s and dot-com boom comes along, all those things are building on the things that came before. But in many ways, we've never really recovered from some of the dislocations of the 1970s. Okay? So what this means there, too, is if economic history, we would think of it rather than just a series of episodes, good, bad, prosperity, not just unprosperity, whatever the word might be in English. But instead, think of economics as being tied to longer-term changes in communication and transportation. We know that these things are going to happen. So apparently the famous prediction guy asked Warren Buffett, somebody said, do you have any predictions about the stock market? He says, yes, it will go up and it will go down, right? But we look back now, suddenly that something that seems so isolated and unique, the Dust Bowl and John Steinbeck and the Great Depression, now you can see, whoa, maybe this is not just one isolated episode, but it's a part of the global capitalism. And this is the way it's going to work, and we're going to keep having these things going on. So I'm going to pause there, because you can see what I'm trying to do is that you can see how that we keep things not only separate in chapters by time, right? But we also keep things separate in chapters by topic. So I learned when I was working on the first edition of my textbook, I learned a word from a high school teacher who said, yeah, we always laugh about how they brown page people. Separate, you can't really figure out how to put them in the story, so you just put them on a brown page with a picture and thing. And it's always, Frederick Douglass, brown page. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, brown page, And I said, last time I could tell, they were living through history exactly the same time as everybody else. But how is it that we would make all this stuff coherent? Now, I think that if I told you what I like about history. It's about surprise, which is the way the world actually works. There's no line that continues forever in human actions. But what I don't like about it is that we chop things up into these little pieces by time so much. And we tend to forget that somebody who lived in slavery lived through all those decades afterwards and would have been around to have read Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and would have been there to be an elderly person in the New Deal. So even though we have all these chapters of industrialization, urbanization, immigration, all that, and you'd think it's like our kids get the impression that there's a new cast on every chapter. Okay, all the 1920s people off, with your flappers and, the tuxes and the cars and all that, and Harlem Renaissance. Hey, you're off now, the Dust Bowl and all that, and tend to forget that they're living across all these times. So what I'm suggesting, I was asked to reflect about how the events of the 20th century grew out of these things. So this is what I'm doing for you, is I'm trying to imagine, if you just turn it like 15 degrees, the things that look so familiar and kind of tired and we know where they go can suddenly look different if you would think about the ways they connect in different ways. So I'm going to pause there. Thank you so very much.